the word lapin to the little Jesus, right? She's teaching a new word, perhaps. And lapin is rabbit in French, in case you didn't know. So, of course, she has to assign the symbol lapin to this object. The baby has to understand it, but it has to work in both directions. And that's what I will argue is a bit special here. So I would like to argue that animals can learn indexes, but not symbols. And it may come to a surprise to you to hear that all of these gorgeous experiments are not really directly about symbols. There are many experiments where chimpanzees have been taught lexigrams for specific concepts, including numbers.
Yes, yes.
Great example here of Matsuzawa's chimpanzee AI. If you see what she's doing, she's systematically pointing to the Arabic numeral that corresponds to a given quantity with perfect success, almost perfect success. Amazing. But I would like to argue that these are not really symbols in the sense that we have in humans. The first thing that other people have argued, there is no compositional syntax. Charles Young has been doing very nice statistical analysis to show that even in so-called cases of language-trained animals, they don't really have novel capacity to compose items. This is very debated. But I would argue there is something even more basic, which is no reversibility. So if I show you a lapin, and I start by saying the word lapin, and then you see the animal, the next time you see the lapin, you would be able to retrieve the corresponding word. You don't care about the order in which things have been presented. There is this reversible assignment of things. It turns out in all of these experiments, the animals have to be taught in the two directions. That is quite explicit in the work of Matsuzawa. If they teach only in one direction, the animal only knows in one direction, from the symbol to the object, but not from the object to the symbol. So there is a little literature on that, and we decided to study it with Timo von Kerkorle. It's no longer in revision, now it's published in eLife. And with my wife, Ghislaine, we designed this experiment based on prior baby work, where we show, for instance, a picture, novel picture, and we associate it with a label. Let's say the word bunyunyu, which is not a word, pseudo word. Okay. And you're going to get a lot of trials in this canonical order, where for a given pair, it's always, let's say, image to word. For the other half, it could be the opposite order, but you get a fixed canonical order. Then we can ask whether you learned this pairing by presenting you a violation of this pairing. So let's say you get some rare trials in which you see the picture, and then there's a delay, and then you hear the wrong word, okay, glishu. And that would be the word for another picture. You should have a surprise response, and this will tell you that you learned the pairing, just tell you that you expect the right word. Okay. But the key condition will be what happens when we do that in a non-canonical order. Non-canonical. So suppose you hear the word bunyunyu, and you as a human would expect to see a picture of the corresponding concept or object. And you would be surprised if you get an incongruent picture. But this is evidence that the symbol has been assigned in a reversible manner, that you get this bidirectional assignment. So would monkeys show that? So in order to test that, we decided that we would use fMRI. This is important because prior behavioral studies, it could be that the animal is not showing the knowledge, but maybe it has the knowledge inside the brain. So here we're going to do whole brain fMRI and to probe the implicit knowledge of the reversed association. And we're going to map the corresponding areas and ask whether this is limited to language areas or just to a very distributed network, and where is it? So this is the design. You get 100% of trials for a few days of a directional association. Two pairs are in the visual to auditory direction, two pairs are in the auditory to visual direction, okay? And then you get all of these trials. It's still 70% of the canonical, but we also present 10% of incongruent, and crucially, 10% of reversed trials with congruent or incongruent cases, so that you cannot relearn here, but you can express your knowledge, right? And we would like to know whether you react to the incongruent situation. So this was done in both humans and monkeys at Neurospin, also with the help of Wim van Duffel in Leuven. We completed with more monkeys. And this slide is just to convince you that the data is high quality. We can easily separate visual and auditory components of the activation. It's not trivial because on every trial you get a visual and an auditory stimulus. And many people think fMRI has no temporal resolution, but that's not true. In the domain of a few hundreds of milliseconds, like here, you can clearly separate the onset of the visual and the onset of the auditory trial, and it swaps when you revert the order of the items, right? And the converse in the auditory cortex. So there is good temporal and spatial resolution in both the human brain and the monkey brain. And then we can ask about these canonical and non-canonical responses to violations of what you've learned. And in humans, very clear, all of the areas in green respond to both violations in the canonical order and in the non-canonical order. It's a huge network. In fact, there are no areas that show an interaction, so they all respond in a reversible manner. When you've learned a word, you know it in the opposite direction. And this network, you see, includes language areas, but it also goes way beyond it. It's bilateral. It goes into the anterior insula. Here it goes into the medial frontal gyrus and into the intraparietal sulcus here. And this situation is completely different in the monkey. In the monkey, we have sensory areas in the back, but we don't have reversible responses. We only have responses to the canonical violation. So we get a nice response when we violate the expectation, but we don't get any in the non-canonical order. So they learn the sequence, but they didn't learn the symbolic association. That's the claim. And in case you worry that this is only using spoken words, so maybe it's unfair to the monkeys, although because we have this violation in the canonical direction, we know that they learned, right, the labels. But we replicated the experiment using visual symbols, lexicograms, similar to what was used in the Matsuzawa chimpanzee. So these sort of tokens that are symbols, but in the visual modalities. Same experiment. There was also another variant, which is that monkeys perhaps were not paying attention. So in order to increase the monkey's attention, we associated half of the pairs with high reward, half of the pictures, half of the symbols, sorry, with high reward, so that they would expect a better reward. And indeed, they attended more to these trials. But still, the result was the same. So you see experiment 1 and 2 in humans, and experiment 1 and 2 in the monkey. We did get frontal lobe activation in the monkey, but only in the canonical direction, nothing in the reverse direction. And you might also worry that this is a null effect, but it's not a null effect because it's a significant interaction. They only detect the congruity effect when it is in the associated forward direction, but not in the reverse direction. So we think that this effect suggests that there is something particular to humans. There was something interesting in the humans as well. It's an illusion. We asked subjects after the experiment, how frequently were these pairs presented? And they knew about the congruent canonical pairs. They knew that the incongruent were rare, but surprisingly, these pairs, which were presented only 10% of the time, the reversed pair, they thought they had been presented a lot. They had no idea about the original order of the pairs and that some pairs were presented in one order and other pairs in the other order. They were generalizing. It's a funny form of generalization because it's not quite logical. We all know that if A, then B, if B, nothing follows, right? So we have something interesting here. There's probably a level of symbolic representation where in order to communicate with other people and even within ourselves, we need this reversible system that constantly goes back and forth between the symbol and the object. And this very elementary experiment, we made it elementary so that the exact same experiment could be done in the monkey and in the human, is showing that there is something quite different in the monkey. Of course, there are many possible qualifications, so we should do more work. Monkeys do not have the same education as the students we have here. One response to that is that my wife has been doing this similar experiment, not exactly the same, but in the baby. And babies of a few months of age, they already show this reversibility of the association. So we think that there's something very basic here to the human brain, perhaps compared to other primate brains. So I move to the second part, which is the idea of composition, as is exemplified by these beautiful symbolic engravings from all parts of the world. Typically, people will combine a zigzag with a circle, make zigzag arms here. We use geometrical symbols in combination with others in order to express more complex ideas, right? So can we study this aspect of composition? We started to study it in the simplest possible case, which is spatial sequences. Our idea is always the same, right? To reduce this to a very, very simple situation so that it can be brought to the monkey. So, and also to young children. So this is the version for young children where I'm going to ask you the same question as the kids. There is a little fish called Bloop, and Bloop will appear in different places. and your task is to follow Bloop and try to guess where he's going. So let's try this. Okay, where is Bloop going next? You know, here, and then here, and then here. We all agree? Yeah. You don't know, right? I mean, how would you know? This is not even single trial learning, it's half of a trial learning. But yet everybody agrees because you've picked the regularity of the geometric sequence and you use it to extrapolate, right? But what kind of regularity are you sensitive to? So we used many variants of this task with all sorts of sequences. You saw one of the simplest one, which is called 4 segments or zigzag. But we also have like 2 squares. You first do 1 square and then another. All of these sequences have the property that they use all of the 8 locations, but they can be completely irregular or they can have symmetries. And to cut a long story short, we found that you need a language, a mini language, a language of geometry to explain what's going on here. That is to say, even for your zigzag, you need something like groups of 2, where there is one item and it's symmetrical relative to some axis, and then another time, and then another time, and then another time. That's the sort of mental formula that you have in mind. So we need primitives of rotation and symmetry, but most important, we need a language that combines them, that is able to say repeat it 4 times. Repeat 4 times that you repeat twice the symmetry operation, something like that. So with this language, we could explain behavior in several experiments in children, in adults. This is an experiment where subjects just move their eyes. You don't have to tell them anything, just say follow it with your eyes. But subjects don't follow, they actually anticipate when they can know where it's going to appear. And the amount of anticipation is a function of the simplicity of the sequence, or rather they anticipate less for the more complex sequences. So you see this nice regression where complexity explains the behavior. High anticipation would be closer to 0 here. So what is this complexity? I go back to that. This is the length of the program that we are assuming, the length of the expression which is capturing the sequence. So if it's completely irregular, there is no way but just to store the 8 successive locations. But if it is compressible, it means that there are some symmetries, some regularities, and the length of the program will be shorter than just the list of the items. So the length of the program is a good predictor of what humans do. It's a good predictor of fMRI in the same exact paradigm when you just track with their eyes. So all of these areas have activation that increase with the complexity, especially in the frontal cortex here. And they also collapse for the higher levels of complexity, because then there is just no rule whatsoever, and you just have to store the item. There is no regularity. So all of these areas are sensitive to regularity. We also found that regularity, or its opposite, complexity, minimal description length, is a very good descriptor of what happens in MEG. Now, of course, in fMRI, you are getting activation to the whole sequence, 8 items. You can't separate the individual items. But with MEG, you can track all of the individual items one by one, right? And so there's a lot of analysis here. We showed that we could decode the geometrical primitives. We could decode the numbers that the subjects have in mind. And here we can decode the groupings that they have in mind. So some of these sequences are grouping by 2s, like the zigzag that you saw. It's 1, 2, another 1, 2, another 1, 2. But some of these sequences are grouping by 4. Like if I do a first square, and then I do a second square, the groupings are by 4. So it's either 2 repeats of 4 or 4 repeats of 2. And we found that we can see this in MEG. We can decode these little numbers that are clicking in the subject's mind to say 1, 2, 1, 2, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. So you can see that in the power spectrum. There's a classic way to use MEG to see the power spectrum of the unfolding operations. They group by 2 or they group by 4. So we argue that there is a high psychological plausibility to this language of geometry, which uses as a critical component primitives of geometry, numbers and loops, a bit like a computer language, for loops, but crucially also their nested recursion. You can have loops inside loops inside loops, right? This is important to have loops inside loops in order to account even for a zigzag. So interestingly, this is a language. We claim that there is a language of geometry, but it's not natural language. And one way to see this is that if we scan the same subjects for natural language, classical localizers for the language system, we see the areas in red, and they're almost completely different and exclusive of the areas for geometry that I just showed you. However, if you scan subjects for mathematics, just something as simple as a calculation, we see that there is a lot of overlap, especially in the parietal cortex here. And so we think that this is a language, but it is a language of mathematics, and it's not the same as natural language. And this is something we repeatedly find. When you do mathematics in your head, you're not using, for the most part, natural language. You're using a more abstract set of circuits that are bilateral, as you can see here, not left lateralized or not a lot left lateralized, very, very different from the inferior frontal and superior temporal STS areas that you find for natural language. So it's already hinting that we have multiple languages in the brain. Now, is this paradigm simple enough to be done in the monkey? I want to acknowledge the wonderful work that Liping Wang's been doing in the lab. He started in the lab, and now he has his own lab in Shanghai. And it's one of the most successful monkey lab ever, I think. If you haven't read his work, it's really fantastic work. So we thought this is a good paradigm for the monkey, because all you have to do is track a sequence, right? Either with your eyes or with your finger. And maybe we would be able to see that the monkeys are not encoding predictions in the same way as humans. It turns out that actually monkeys can do a lot. So I start by showing you what Liping was able to achieve. Monkeys can learn a sequence of items on the screen, for instance, 1, 2 here, and they can reproduce it. And he's even been able to train them to reproduce it forward or backwards. And they can do both. And they can do both on a cue. So here there is a cue, or maybe it's a whole block where they reverse, actually. So you're going to see always performance of the reverse sequence. They see ABC and they do CBA. And Liping has been able to show that you can go to a length of 4, barely, for some monkeys. But most importantly, they really understand the task. So you can generalize to new displays. I think we're going to see, okay, the first time they see a pyramidal display, they immediately understand that they have to store the 4 locations or 3 locations and reproduce them backwards. So it's pretty impressive behavior. They can store sequences and they can reproduce them, and they can have them in working memory. So what's different? Well, one thing which is different is that the sequence length is very, very hard to go beyond 3 or 4 items. Liping is now just succeeding, but at the time I prepared this talk, it was still impossible. And learning is incredibly slower than humans. I mean, we were talking about half of a trial learning, but in monkeys, we're talking about tens of thousands of trials, very slowly progressing the difficulty so that they can achieve this behavior. But the most important is that monkeys do not seem to grasp geometrical structures. So here's one way to see this. If you have these length 4 sequences, there are exactly 30 spatial patterns that you could have. The simplest one, which we all find the simplest, is rotating around the display of 6 items, right? So, and in humans, we all find that these are the same, right? We just go around the circle. That's what we called in our language would be +1 power 4, because we do 4 times rotating around the circle. So there are 30 such patterns. And here there is a huge difference between humans and monkeys. Humans have very little within pattern variability, but they have a lot of between pattern variability, and the exact converse for monkeys. So monkeys care about the individual locations. We care about the geometric organization. You can see this in this way here. Here the 30 possible patterns have been sorted as a function of how they were in children. And you can see that the order is reproduced in adults, so the adults perform much better, but not at all in the monkey. At the top of the hierarchy, you find going around the circle, but for monkeys, it's not particularly easy. It's actually a bit more difficult because they're closer together. Okay. So monkeys in this sort of experiments don't seem to care at all, at least spontaneously, about regularities. They care about the individual items and how they are stored. They want to store slots in working memory, but they don't seem to compress the information as we do using geometric regularity. So the compression component is missing. And the real proof of that, I think, came from the work that Liping published in Science 2022. He has this incredible ability, first of all, to train monkeys to do these sort of things. In this case, 3 items successively stored in working memory. So you see 3 successive locations, and then there's a long delay where you can probe the working memory of the monkey, and then he reproduces it forward or now backward. Okay. And the real prowess here is also to record from thousands of neurons using 2-photon calcium imaging in the prefrontal cortex. Now, Liping also does it with electrophysiology. The results are the same or even better. There's a second science paper, 2025. I would strongly advise you to check it if you don't know about it. But I'm going to talk just about the first paper to say what he found is just 3 slots. Reduce this space of possible activity to a 6-dimensional space, which is actually 3 two-dimensional spaces, each coding for one of the locations, the first location, the second location, and the third location that you have to store in working memory. And the activation during the delay is the sum of the activation of the vectors corresponding to each of these 3 two-dimensional spaces. So it's just slots. I will not go into more detail. I could answer your questions, but in monkeys, so far, in these monkeys that are trained with all sorts of sequences, it's just slots. Now, this is not quite the end of the story, and I'm eagerly waiting for more data from leaping, because if you train a monkey with a subset of these sequences, then they begin to compress them. But in the spontaneous situation, they will not compress them. So there is something quite different in the human brain. The human brain sort of jumps to the conclusions. There is a regularity. I will find it. I find it. You know, you guess before you see the end of the sequence. Monkeys may get to this point where they compress the information, but they don't typically do it unless you give them tens of thousands of trials where you see the need for compression. So in this paper, there is no evidence whatsoever for compression, just 3 slots. But it's also a great advance, I think, in terms of understanding what it means for a slot to be encoded in a vector space of thousands of neurons. It's really beautiful. This is where you get my music. You all know this piece by Bach, very famous. I want to ask whether we could perhaps have the same sort of geometrical regularity for music as we have for actual geometric sequences. So if you look at the writing by Bach himself here, apparently, you can almost see the zigzag, right? This is zigzag music, in a sense. A bit reductive to say that. It's gorgeous music, but you can see the pattern of going up and down, which has been put in the musical notation in the form of a geometric organization. So is it the same sort of language? So we found that we could ask this question because we have a very specific language for spatial sequences, and we could ask, will it generalize to auditory sequences? So here is the task. You're going to have to memorize the sequence. We're not going into the full task, but let me have you listen to the stimuli. You ready? Could you repeat it? Do you have it in mind? Yeah, I think so. Yeah. How about this one? Yeah, more or less. Sometimes it takes 2 listening. What about this one? No, this is a disaster, right? And this one you could listen to multiple times and not know. So this is the highest complexity. When we say highest complexity, we don't mean random, by the way, we mean worse than random, right? Because using our language, we can compute these numbers, which is the length of the description of this sequence in the language that we have in mind. And we have to pick sequences that are maximal complexity, in a sense. They have no compressible regularities whatsoever. So you understand, we have these numbers that predict the complexity according to the language. And the really nice thing is that it's the same exact language that we use for space. We just have 2 locations in a sense here, A and B, and so you can just stay there or change to the other, but otherwise the language is exactly the same. It's a language of loops. And so, for instance, the first one you heard was 2 pairs, 2 groups of 2, followed by 4 alternations, and you repeat the whole thing, right? That's how we would compress this information. That's more or less what you have in mind when you listen to that. So, very same language as geometry, immediately predicts what you're going to do in this working memory task for musical sequences. I wouldn't call it music. I think I should apologize for the metaphor with Bach. I mean, this is very, very far from Bach. But let's call it minimal music, binary music. So how do we test your memory? In this case, we find it easier to just change one note, and you have to detect if there's a note that's wrong. So this one is wrong here. Or maybe we introduce a completely new tone that shouldn't be there. And in both cases, your ability to detect both in response time and miss rate here is a function of the minimal description length. Minimal description length is a great predictor of your ability to remember the sequence and also your response time to the deviance. Also subjective complexity. We just have to ask you, like I did, you know, how complex was it? and this is well correlated with minimal description lengths. We can do model selection. Here there have been many, many models of the complexity of sequences. For instance, one of them is Lempel-Zip complexity, just to zip the sequence, and there is a fixed algorithm zipping it, algorithmic complexity, entropy, and so on. There are all these proposals in the literature, but we can show that our language of thought complexity is a better predictor of human complexity in both subjective and objective aspects. And in fact, we had to change slightly the model because it's actually compression, but taking into account the clusters of nodes. Several A's go together, we don't break them. So this is a very small change of the language here. We did this behavior during fMRI. So you can see here, it's incredible, actually. It's quite rare, I think, in psychology to have such correlation coefficients with the predictor that we had from other experiments, right? So this is the ability to detect the deviance in a sequence in fMRI, predicted by the language of thought complexity predictor that we had. And another thing that we had in this fMRI experiment is at the end of the experiment, we asked subjects to put brackets on a visual depiction of the sequence to tell us what they thought was the organization. And you can see that where they place the brackets corresponds nicely to where our model would actually put parentheses to change from one subprogram to another, for instance. So there is this idea of subprograms that subject seems to spontaneously bring to the task here. So what's the prediction for fMRI? The prediction is the same as for visual sequences, is that if you just measure the activation to the whole sequence, it should, by and large, it should increase with the complexity of the encoding of the internal model. So the more complex the sequence, the longer the minimal description length, the more activation you should have. The only thing is that it should collapse towards the end because this is essentially not compressible. So if it's not compressible, then you should really not have a strong representation in the human brain. And the prediction is exactly the opposite for violations. If you are able to measure the activation to violations, they should be very easy to detect when you have a simple model. They should become slower and most difficult to detect when you have a more complex internal model. So this very specific pattern of activation that we looked for, and we found it in these areas at the whole brain level. This is work with Pascal Rumi in the lab and Samuel Planton, and again, Liping Wang. So you see in all of these areas, there is this increase of the activation with the complexity of the sequence and a slight decrease at the end in most of these areas because of the higher complexity of this random looking sequence. And for the deviance, we easily detect activation to the deviance when it's in simple sequences. It's more and more difficult to detect it. It's still significant when we go to the more complex sequences. So this pattern of increase, quadratic, and decrease here is present in all of these regions. What are they? You can see bilateral regions again. You can again see the anterior intraparietal region that we had for the spatial geometric sequences. Again, see especially this very strong, intense activation in the precentral regions. That probably, is the most important for coding of the structure of the sequence. And now it's attached to additional activation in the superior temporal gyrus, because of course it's an auditory sequence. So we speculate that these components may be common to the structure of the language. And that component has to do with the specific content, which is sounds in this case, but was spatial content in the other case. So now we are trying to replicate this work in the very same subjects, asking whether there is an abstract language here and specific sounds in other areas. But that would be the prediction. But there is also a cerebellum component that you can see here. I'm not at all a specialist of the cerebellum, so maybe you are, but I think it makes sense that there would be a contribution of the cerebellum to the structures. But there is a lot of evidence the cerebellum is not just coding sequences in humans, but actually structures, including the structures of language in other paradigms. Okay, I think I'm doing more or less okay. I still have 15 minutes, something like that. Yeah. So I want to move you to yet another paradigm where we're trying to do even simpler things. The auditory sequence is nice, and we've been using it in monkeys as well, but we were thinking, what about if we just show geometry? I'm back to the original picture. I show you the Lascaux rectangle, this nice rectangle in Lascaux. When you go to Lascaux and you see a rectangle, you get to any cave, you see on a shell a zigzag, or a rectangle, you immediately know it's been a human. There's no animal that does that ever. So we thought about that and we wondered, could we have a paradigm that would show just a rectangle and still ask, about human uniqueness and human geometry? So here is the task now, and this is a PhD work of a wonderful guy, Matthias Sablemeyer. Detect the outlier shape. Can you see the outlier? I hope so. Can you see the outlier? Can you see the outlier? Much harder. It's still the same one, actually. It's this. And all of these outliers, they're all made by moving the bottom right corner by the same amount, actually, in all of these possible directions, right? 4 possible directions. But we vary the shape as being the base shape, basically, to which these shapes are compared. We also swap them. So what is the distractor can be the standard shape and vice versa. But you see that these shapes span, as we did before, a whole range of complexity. The simplest are the ones that have the most regularity. They are the square and the rectangle. And then we remove progressively these regularities to have shapes like maybe the rhombus here, just equal sides but not equal angles, and so on and so forth, until we go to completely irregular shape. And is this new version of geometrical regularity going to have an effect on behavior? The answer is yes. So in this task that you just did at the beginning, this is the behavior. This is not 0.4%, it's 40%. I'm sorry for the confusion, but it's actually a very high level of errors in detecting the outlier when it's very high complexity shape, and it's very easy to detect it among rectangles and squares, right? So these are highly compressible because there is a lot of regularity. A small number of parameters are needed to specify a square compared to this shape, right? We found that this is a human universal. We can replicate it. These were actually online experiments done during COVID, but some were not online experiments. The correlation is pretty good, actually, across experiments. We can do classical visual search if you don't like the intruder task. So that's the Treisman version of the task. Subjective ratings, once again, I think this is important, by the way. These are introspectable representations. Many representations in the brain are not introspectable, but they are conscious constructions. This is super important. We can present just the 4 corners of the square as a sequence. So this is bridging to the previous work. And that means that we are beyond representations in the ventral visual pathway. And I will show that to you later, because we just show the 4 corners and it's enough to get pop out from squares, but not from other shapes. And we can replicate that in preschoolers, although you see that they tend to really favor rectangles and squares, but there's still a little bit of a correlation with complexity here. But there is clearly a developmental pattern, but they are already quite aware of some notion of regularity that has not been taught to them. Most important was this work in the Himba, done with Serge Caparros. The Himba are in Namibia. They don't have formal education in mathematics at all. We tested only uneducated subjects here, and yet they have the complexity effect. You see it's noisier, and I'll come back to that, because it's not just noise. So now we can ask monkeys, if monkeys see a rectangle, are they aware of anything special about the rectangle or the square? So how do you test that? Our prediction was that they would fail due to the shape regularity effect. We were very lucky to collaborate with Joël Fagot in the south of France that has this amazing baboon facility. You can submit him experiments. Now it's Nicolas Clédier who is the head of this. The baboons are free-ranging, and they have this booth that you can see with a little door. And at any time, they can enter the booth, and the computer will recognize them and present them the next trial on any experiment with a touchscreen. And they just love it. They get food pellets. They are not food deprived or anything, just get little pellets. But I think mostly it's the video game addiction, as we all are addicts a little bit, right? So some go at 2 in the morning. They just can't help it, it seems. So we train them. So we train them to do the intruder task with non-geometric stimuli. So we find the intruder here, find any of these intruders among the other shapes, right, in any possible pairs here. We trained on all of these pairs, and we show that there is generalization to all of these new pairs. So really, they understood the intruder task with all of its possible variants here. They knew they had to search for the intruder. And then we moved them to the geometric stimuli for the first time. And I remind you, this is what you find in humans, a very huge geometric regularity effect, not just in Einstein, but in preschoolers and Himba. And this is the baboons. and this is completely flat. And in fact, it's very hard for them. So they start above chance, but really making a lot of errors, 75% errors. And then they improve. We're talking here of blocks where the blocks are several hundreds of trials. So I think we're talking about 3,000 trials moving from one point to the next. So they do improve very, very slowly, and they're always better than chance. But even when they improve, there is no geometric regularity. They don't seem to notice that there's something special about squares and rectangles that they could use to facilitate the task. However, they don't do nothing. They don't do random judgments. They are all correlated with each other. So all of these names are baboons, okay? And they're all correlated with each other in their behavior. And all of the humans are correlated together in their behavior. So something is happening. And we searched and we thought that we could model it with a convolutional neural network. Very easy. You have vectors for each of the 6 shapes. You pick the vector. You decide the intruder is the vector, which is most different from the others, right? This is an excellent model of what the baboons do. So the baboons seem to be using something like ventral visual pathway, CNN, to pick out the intruder. Okay. It's a good model for every baboon, but it's not a good model for the more advanced humans here. You see the violet regressor, purple regressor is not very good or not significant or a little bit. We need another predictor for humans. And again, that's a symbolic model. That's a model where we count how many geometric properties are present in the shape. And that's the best predictor of the human behavior. And now we can explain what happens to the IMBAs and the preschooler. They were noisier. In fact, they are not noisier. They are correlated with both. Because, of course, in humans, we still have a ventral visual pathway. Of course, we can look at a shape just like we look at a face or an object, right? So it's a strategy that is available to all humans. You see, all humans are already symbolic in a sense. But the more educated you are, the more you are relying on the symbolic strategy and the less you are relying on the ventral visual pathway strategy. That's what we are finding here. So it means that there are 2 routes to the perception of geometric shapes. There's a classic route, just like any other picture perhaps, and there is a non-classical route, which is geometry, symbols, understanding that there are categorical properties of parallelism, right angles, and so on. So I just take it with a grain of salt, right? So initially we said, well, CNN suck, you know, they're terrible because, you know, they can't even recognize a square. And that was true at the time, by the way. And it's still true that these networks have a lot of problems with geometry. So at that time, it's only 2 or 3 years ago, it was enough to present a square, and these networks could not at all mimic human behavior. There's a strong criticism. But now it's changing, and we're working on this new paper. You have these new, first of all, vision transformers, but also CNNs that have been trained with a much larger database. And there's some kind of threshold which is being crossed in some of them, and they begin to be just as good as a symbolic model, maybe even better in predicting the human representational dissimilarity matrix. So here you have the human RDM, and this is the RDM from ConvNext, which has been trained with a lot more pictures than ImageNet, which was the initial training set. And suddenly you begin to have very good representation of what humans do. So I don't know, I wouldn't want to make too strong a point here because part of the training set is human created. Part of the training set is patterns that we have created as a human species. So you cannot just say it will emerge spontaneously. It's part of the training set, right? And we don't really know what's in the training set here. There's a lot of stuff in there. But it's possible at least that the architecture of a CNN could mimic what humans do. Architectures of transformer also mimic what humans do. So we begin to have a model that we could rely on to begin to understand how the information is encoded. The problem with these symbolic models is that at the end, of course, it has to be a neural network, right? But just a special kind of neural network that is able to do symbols and syntax. And we don't really know how this is being done. So maybe these models will help us to figure out how it's being done by neural networks. So that's for the future. So we also did imaging of that. And I'm a little bit excited about that. It's work which is currently being submitted to eLife, so you can find it online in an intermediate stage in eLife. We did fMRI of, first of all, very simple stuff, just a geometrical shape compared to classical things like faces, objects, houses, etc. And we find there is a general deactivation of the ventral visual pathway, much less activation to these shapes. And instead, a lot of activation of what we also see as the mass responsive network, especially in the right hemisphere. right anterior APS, especially in young children here, and also right ventral inferotemporal or close to the LOC activation. So it's quite striking that these shapes seem to escape to some extent the ventral visual processing pathway and activate much more dorsal route as well as this LOC. Yeah, we are doing RDMs, and we are finding something very similar to what we find in behavior. So this is just a replication of the behavior. Human RDMs, they are much better correlated by the symbolic geometrical fixtures than by the classical CNN. So we see, again, the fact that humans seem to be driven by symbolic features. When we do this in representational similarity analysis of fMRI, we find dorsal pathway activation accounts or is well accounted by geometrical features, RSA, whereas the neural network is really accounting only for the early part of the activation in the more occipital pole and occipitotemporal pathway. And we do that as well in MEG. I think MEG is the best experiment because we just expose subjects passively to these shapes centrally, one at a time. So there is no issues with peripheral eye movements or anything like that, just one shape at a time. And we just tell subjects, pay attention. And sometimes there are deviants. And the deviance detection in MEG, without any sort of behavior, the deviant activation is directly related to the theoretical metric, which is our complexity measure. So simple geometries create much stronger and much earlier activation compared to more complex geometries of these quadrilaterals. And also, very interestingly, we have this sequential effect here, where the neural network activation comes first, and only after about 200 milliseconds, we see activation well accounted for, significantly accounted for by the symbolic metric. This is again in RSA. So we think that there is really these two visual pathways to the perception of shape, geometric shapes. One early one, which is the classical CNN, well modeled by a CNN, and one which is requires a more symbolic representation. I think it's late, so I'm going to skip this part, which is about generalizing to new shapes. And I just want to say that I think there is something particular about human conscious representations. So this connects a little bit to my work on consciousness. We all have a conscious global workspace. It's present in many, many animal species, certainly in monkeys, and certainly also in corvids. We share also the same core concepts, but the idea is that the contents of our consciousness is much richer because we possess an internal language of thought. We can conceive of expressions in this language of thought that go way beyond what other animals are able to conceive. We are able to conceive of a square or a rectangle, and they are not able to conceive of a square or rectangle, or at least not without enormous amounts of training. We do that spontaneously by making these representations click together in little mental impressions. We call them mental programs, expressions in the language of thought. And we think that something has changed massively during hominization. Neural codes much have changed in the human, not just by expansion of areas, but also by the acquisition of a recursive mode of processing. We can call it languages, but it has to be languages in the plural, because it's not just natural language. It's also, as you can see, other networks that are of a more mathematical nature that also have their own language, very simple languages for geometry or music, and they seem to involve very different areas. We are not, of course, the only ones to show that there are dissociations between these languages. For instance, this beautiful work by Fedorenko showing that the activations to music are nicely dissociable from activations to natural language, spoken language. I don't disagree with I don't agree with Eve on much of what she's saying about the language faculty, but the dissociation between language and music, I think, is very clear. And likewise, the dissociation between language and math is extremely clear, and we find it in a lot of other works that I didn't have time to talk about. So that means that during hominization, it's not just one system that changed. There once was this speculation that maybe just Broca's area changed, and that created a lot more abilities for recursion. I think we know now that it's a much more bilateral, much more expanded network. Probably recursion and language-like abilities emerged in many, many different systems, allowing us to have all of these different cultural devices, writing, spoken language, mathematics, music, etc. Okay, so this is just a visualization of this hypothesis. You can read about it in the Sticks paper. we assume that all of these networks have discrete symbols, all have composition, all have a formal grammar, and all have this notion of minimal description length. But maybe what explains that dissociation is in part that mathematics is a lot about symmetrical structures and repetition with variation, whereas linguistic structures actually avoid repetition. They create merge structures and they really try to avoid repetition in order to compress the information even more for communication purposes. I think I'm going to skip some of this. We could come back to that. And I just conclude with one statement, which is, I think there is something really special to be looked at in the human brain. If this view is right, there are human-specific neural codes for symbols and syntax, and that means that we should be looking for it. And neural networks are sometimes not appropriate. We need to look for higher level symbolic structures. Of course, they have to be implemented. I believe that this is implemented. So I believe the concepts of symbols and recursion are a first approximation of the dynamics of complex biological neural networks. But we need to look for neural codes specifically in the human brain, not just in the monkey brain. And of course, it's nice if we can compare the two directly, as I show sometimes. So I just want to show you one little piece of evidence to conclude. It's very recent. It was a science paper just last year with Peter Rufsema. It's 8 years in the making, so I can tell you a work of love. The idea is very simple. You know that there are these concept cells in the brain. Concept cells, particularly in the hippocampus, will react to a person, whether you show the name or whether you show the picture of the person. And in this case, this is a concept cell that loves Shrek for some reason. Yeah, you know, so they try different pictures. They like to use pictures of actors, and you find the cell that responds to Shrek, and not to a family member. You see the spikes here. The question that we ask is, would this cell respond to pointers? And in language, pointers are pronouns. In all of these languages, we need pointers to be able to retrieve information, use it again in another context, etc., etc. So that's the very simple experiment. Shrek and Courtney Love went into a bar. That sounds like a joke, right? That he sat at the table. Who sat at the table? Shrek, of course, because it's he, right? If I said she, it would be Courtney Love. If I said he, but Shrek was not present in the earlier sentence, then you wouldn't think about Shrek, right? So that's the question we ask. Is there reactivation of these cells, the concept cells, when you present a pronoun? Is there a pointer-like relation? And that's exactly what we found. This is single cell data. So that's the Shrek cell responding to Shrek when it appears in the first sentence, not when it does not appear in the black line, and responding to the pronoun only when the pronoun has the right gender to be able to refer to Shrek, not when it was, not if it's a feminine pronoun in green, not if it's a masculine pronoun in black, but there was no Shrek to begin with, right? So just pure reference. And this is the same data for from 53 different cells. So this is the average when it's the first word or the second word in the first noun phrase, and the reactivation to the pronoun. This is perhaps the most interesting. This is decoding. So there are 3 possible words in these experiments, and this is decoding the specific word that the person has in mind for the pronoun, actually for the first noun and then for the pronoun. One is 100% correct. So just from a few cells, like that, 53 cells, you can decode 100% correct, almost, what is the referent of the pronoun. So I think it's just an example to say, you know, we need to look for these properties. There are properties like that in the human brain, such as pointers, but much more, right? There's got to be recursion. There's got to be symbolic structures. There's got to be syntax. We have to be serious about believing the linguist when they tell us there was a very precise syntactic structures with principles and parameters. I believe in that. I believe it's a first approximation, but I believe there are languages of the brain that we have to find a lot of missing neural representations that probably are there and are quite specific to the human brain. Now, that's the many people who did the work. I especially want to point to Liping Wang, who was in his independent lab doing incredible monkey work and soon human work as well. And he's going to probably solve it at the neural level. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Hey, thank you so much for the talk. Measure inspiring as always. It's good to be. We're going to open the floor for questions from the audience. So if anyone has a question, let's start with Joanna.
Oh, the microphone is coming.
Thanks a lot. It's really inspiring work. So I'm thinking about this geometry that they have in code. Do you think there is topography in them? Meaning there's nearby neurons process, similar geometries or sequences. So if it's a simple sequence or a simple geometry, they will be encoded by nearby neurons, and further on in that network, then nearby neurons will encode more complex simple geometries.
So you mean, well, the assumption that we made and that we validated with the RSA is that neurons care about symbolic properties. So for instance, if there is parallelism of two sides, then these shapes will be more similar at the neural level, right? But you mean physically close neurons, like nearby on the cortex?
Yeah. For example, in the sequences, we have easy sequences and more complex sequences, and you show it very nicely in the networks of this complexity of the sequences. My question, if you think that physical neighboring neurons process kind of simpler.
No, I don't think so. Okay, yeah. So what we see with Liping Wang, I mean, what's beautiful, by the way, about two-photon imaging is you see every single neuron, at least within a certain depth, and you can see their geometrical organization now on the surface of the cortex, right? And you can move the microscope around. So the finding is that these neurons are completely intermingled. In the same minuscule bit of prefrontal cortex, 500 microns aside, you can find all of these neurons being mixed together. For the slots in the monkey, right? It's not exactly the same as what you are asking, but I think that in prefrontal cortex, it's very much distributed representations that are intermingled, at least in prefrontal cortex.
Thank you.
Thanks. David?
Okay, thank you so much. This is wonderful. So you began by talking about the reversibility of symbolic associations. I'm wondering how the symbolic learning system knows which observations about the world are reversible and which ones aren't.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a great question. We were surprised. My expectation was that at least some areas of the human brain would learn in a single direction, right? Maybe a non-unconscious association, something like that, but everything was dominated by the reversible associations. I suspect this is not the rule, and that we will find some triggering conditions where you do or do not treat something as a symbolic association. But we haven't found this so far. There are some really nice baby experiments, infant experiments, where you ask exactly this question, and people have found that it's not so much the content, for instance, is it speech or not? We found that indeed it does not matter too much. It can be a lexigram, right? But what matters is the communication intent. Infants will treat even gibberish R2D2 style music as a label if they have seen people exchanging this sort of information in a very nice series of experiments. Yeah. So I suspect that we humans bring a sort of communication or symbolic perspective onto the situation, and that was the case apparently in our subjects. But we really should find the boundary where this happens on.
Do you think the reversibility is crucial to what makes a symbol a symbol?
I think it's just one of the properties. It's not sufficient. There are many cases where it's reversible and it's not sufficient. But so I would think one property is this reversibility. Another is potential arbitrariness. So you can associate a symbol to anything. I was so sure saying that a century ago, arbitrary association and arbitrary links, signs, we call it signs. The third property is entering into a symbol system. So there is no symbol alone. There is a system of symbols that can combine with each other. A typical example is Arabic numerals, where it's not just one item, but you can manipulate the items, combine them to get new knowledge. So I think these are the basic properties. There's a nice paper by Andreas Nieder where he discusses that, linked with the work of Terry Deacon and some other more philosophical work. So yeah, it's part of the difficulty is to define what we mean by symbols. Not fully clear, but I think this would be the basic property.
Yana?
Thank you for your working circle. And I want to ask you, when you talk that our natural language does not somehow overlap with the geometrical language, do you think that this is true for all languages, or there are languages that are more logic than others?
Huh.
And
That's an interesting question, yeah. No, I think all natural languages are very, very similar to each other, but this has not been super investigated. There is one nice paper again by Fedorenko, where she looks at all of the world's families of languages. She scans people. It's a very basic contrast, so that's the limit of the exercise, I suppose, but a basic contrast of sentences versus word lists or pseudo-word lists will show you exactly the same network of language areas, left lateralized, all along the STS and in Broca's area, being activated by all of these languages. I don't know of languages that would go more dorsally, like we see for this bilateral mass responsive network. Although there is this issue with computer languages. So what I describe is closer to mental programs or computer languages, right? And it seems that this network is activated when you do computer language. But we need to do these experiments again and again, and now within the same subject, right? This is very important. High resolution 7 Tesla. We should do language, music, math, whatever, and dissociate these networks. We're beginning to do that.
That are more logic, that at least words more logic, the way they form words than others.
Yeah. I think I vouch more for similarity than for distinctions, but I do want to go back to that slide for 1 second because I forgot to say one important thing. Even the term language is not right for natural language because there are multiple levels of combinations, and there are at least those 3: phonology, syntax, and semantics. All of these levels have compositionality in ways that seem to be particular to humans. So this was already noted by a linguist a century ago, particularly in France. The phonology involves combinations of vowels, consonants according to specific phonotactics. Then syntax involves combining parts of speech and even individual features that are morphemes to get to syntactic combinations. And then there is a semantic level. And that's exactly where I disagree very strongly, I think, with Fedorenko. This is not one system. These are 3 different networks, very easy to dissociate, actually, in fMRI, and not one network doing the whole thing.
Thank you again for the excellent talk. You mentioned in some of these humanistic representations of the geometry that some of them were done with babies. But I was wondering...
With what? Sorry?
With babies. So it means that since they are babies, they are little kids, these representations are already present in humans compared to baboons or other non-humans. I was wondering whether these, of course, in all the studies you mentioned, or it's just some of them were done with babies, because some of these representations might require learning, so this learning acquisition of language of sometimes of these concepts, which is not present in babies, and other things are already present in babies as they are born.
That's a great question, yes. I think what babies are born with is the ability to compose, the symbolic machine and the ability to compose. But you're completely right. The specific compositions that we will create may or may not exist in a given child and may take time to develop. I guess that's also the slide I skipped. We all start in life with the same primitives, the same language of thought, so the same symbols and concepts will be found simple because they are the closest to these basic primitives. So I think it can explain that we have the same concepts of number. We don't go all the way to the more complex system, but we all have the same primitives of number. And across cultures, you find the concept of the spiral or the maze, for instance. They're all very natural ideas in a certain sense. They're derived. You would not find them in a baby, but sufficiently close to the initial state that the composition is not too bad, is not too complex. And so they tend to be universal, or at least they appear independently in different cultures. But then at the higher level, you begin to have all sorts of, this compositional ability is so wide that you can think of an incredible amount of ideas including crazy ideas such as a snake with 7 heads, right? I just said it. I gave you the expression, a snake with 7 heads, and suddenly you have that in your mind as a composition. Even though it does not exist, you're never going to see one. I think it explains the cultural divergence, and it creates ability to think things like that, which I really liked from the demonstration against Trump, of course, the first Trump, actually. This is the joke. It's no longer time to joke, actually, I'm afraid. But I like this one because it points to square root of -1, which is, I think, a great example of expansion of mathematics. Square root of -1 is a valid expression, but it's also a crazy expression. It's meaningless, right? I remember very well being shocked when I was told that you could think of square root of -1. But it's a thinkable expression. It is something you can formulate, and you can work with it, and there are correct rules for processing with it, and then you discover it's very useful. So I think it's very typical of the expansion of concepts in humans. We create chimeras all the time. Some of these chimeras are crazy and just become myths or religions. Some are actually useful, and we keep them and we propagate them in our culture. That's what I think happens a lot. So babies, of course, cannot think square root of -1, but they have the potential to get there. Every single human has the potential to get there.
Yeah. Right.
Would you think that engaging with this geometry and math parts, when reading or hearing natural language describing geometry or math, in more engaging in them might predict better mathematical, for example, kids solving mathematical problems rather than just reading, just processing in a foreign language.
Yeah, so I think that language is actually a useful device to bring together these ideas. So even though these ideas are not represented in natural language, the word I use here is a catalyst, or people have used the term scaffold. So the ideas of mathematics are not in language, but the language of the teacher can bring together these ideas just like a catalyst. You know, you bring them temporarily together, and then they stay together because they are useful combination or stable combination. So yeah, I mean, these ideas remain to be tested, but they fit well with a whole array of educational practices where people say you put a loudspeaker on the teacher's thought, you explain everything, explicit teaching, and that helps apparently to propagate mathematical ideas. And otherwise, they do not develop, they are complex ideas, right? So they do not necessarily develop spontaneously in every child.
While you guys think of other questions, let me ask sort of a segue to this one, which would be, why do we use that when we describe objects? I mean, there's a compositional approach as well.
Yes.
In fact, when you think about whatever you build, it's more, if it is a non-real object, you could think of it as components, and some components are geometric.
Absolutely, yeah. And composite tools are a marker of humanity.
Yeah, exactly. So is it true in the case that, so you showed us the difference between geometrical figures and objects, and obviously you see for geometry and ventral street for objects. Is it the case that what we're really contrasting there is objects versus the geometry, or is it that you're contrasting texture versus a bunch of other stuff against geometry? Or say it differently, do we not use this symbolic geometrical sort of language when we think about objects? Because sometimes we do. You can say, well, there's object, the rectangular thing, and then go with that thing, right?
No, that's a great question. There's a lot more experiments to do to find the boundaries. And obviously, there are very distant conditions in fMRI, so it's our first attempt. And I think the most important aspect of this fMRI is the RSA within the quadrilaterals. But the basic difference between geometric shapes and the rest, I mean, this requires a lot of intermediate cases. I think it makes sense when we design objects, we use a lot of geometry. Once the object is designed, do we still use it or not? Maybe we just use their texture, maybe we just use their overall bottom-up shape, CNN-like shape, right? But if this view is correct, there is always two ways to look at things. A geometrical way and there is a non-geometrical way.
So, question that we'll ask Stan. Yeah. One there, then.
Thank you very much, Stan. I think we needed like a one-day workshop just to be into this presentation. But I was curious about, so I'm from the neuropsychological field, neuropsychological assessment of things. There was probably also things about the coursive working task and spatial working task, like in MTech or the spatial school, or different kinds of tasks that you use. And I was thinking about this property of the human brain that we found in different studies across, for example, vision tasks and working memory tasks, linked to prediction. So, and I'm thinking about if you have any thoughts about why the brain uses predictions so well. So in different contexts, to use the predictions is to risk an error sometimes. But it's most of the time is the most efficacy way. So the better way to do it.
Yeah.
Why we do this even in different tasks?
I think that what AI has been finding is that predicting is a wonderful way to learn. If you can predict and then compare what you predicted with what you get, the error signal is an incredibly informative signal for learning, changing your representation. So I think this trick has been around for a long time in evolution, but in humans, the mental model that you use to predict has this even more abstract capacity. We're using incredibly compact representations of things that generalize across a much broader array of situations. So that's how I would view things. Prediction is all over the place, and including in very, very simple animals. But our predictions arise not just from the same models as other animals, but from this very high level, even, you could call it science. I think, in a sense, the ideas I'm developing here is that humans started with a scientific approach, trying to find formulas for regularities that they were finding in the external world and being very successful at it.
Thanks, Sam, for the great talk. Really amazing. I think it's a follow-up from Louis' question, but more basic one, since I'm not in the area. Do you think it's this unique quality of humans that will save us from being overtaken by machines, AI, or there's some hope that there's actually, we can process things so much better than machines?
The subtitle of my book, How We Learn, is called How Humans Learn Better Than Any Machine for Now. And that book is already, what, 4 years old, 3 years old, 5 years old, I forgot. But I think it's...
It could not exist in a machine. It's machinery. It could not exist in a machine. It's machinery. It's biological machinery. We just have to figure it out. And when we figure it out, very, very quickly, AI people, adapt it to their machines. And in fact, now it's even happening autonomously, in a sense, right? They're finding new tricks that we didn't think about. So, no, I don't think this is going to save us from competition with AI. I still think, however, that the human brain is much superior at the moment. In so many different aspects. So one of them is, of course, energy consumption. And that's very important because it determines how quickly you can, or how many answers you can get, and so on. Where AI is very superior, and that's really worrisome, I think, is in, you could just call it not dying. We die and we lose everything we learned, right? And we have to start from scratch as a species. So that's why we have education. We're pretty good at that. But education could collapse, first of all, right? It's collapsing now in some places. Machines are incredibly good at compiling a lot of knowledge in one place. in ways that we humans simply cannot do. When you look at current models, they know all of the languages, or maybe 100 languages of the world. No human can do that, maybe one on Earth. When they know every geographical place on Earth, nobody can do that. So we are already overtaken, no doubt. I have very little doubt that these sort of recursive abilities, they're already there in a sense, right? In many cases. I play a lot with AI. I had a lot of slides about the failures of AI. I could show a few of them, but they get outdated so quickly. Maybe I can show a few of them still, just as a matter of closure and make you laugh a little bit. I left them out. Where are they? Yeah. So if we look at this one first, if you see this picture, a few years ago, so you know what this is, right? This was labeled as ping pong balls with this incredible amount of confidence. Okay. And why ping pong balls? Because of the texture, but no attention to geometry whatsoever. These are not spheres. Right? They should be spheres, but they are not. ChatGPT 3 on fractions, I think they corrected that now, although I think they just have a patch, and so it's very easy to fall along the same track. What's larger, 2/4 or 1/2? ChatGPT. 1/2 is larger than 2/4, right? 2/4 can be written as 2/4, which is equal to 1/2. Therefore, 1/2 is equal to 2/4. So that's me coming back. Didn't you just contradict yourself? I apologize. We all know this. Right? I apologize. I made a mistake in my previous answer. 2/4 is smaller than 1/2. By the way, it's the same as what he said before. He just said 1/2 is larger than 2/4. They have no idea. Okay. Are you sure? Yes, I'm sure. 2/4. Blah, blah, blah. It makes no sense whatsoever. Right? So now it is being corrected in ChatGPT 4, but you'll find very similar errors. Maybe I have a few more. Okay. You get this sort of thing, which is incredible, right? Imaging Darth Vader in 19th century dress. It's perfect. I don't know how many humans on Earth could do this. But now ask it, imagine a green triangle to the left of a blue circle, and you get that. Okay. And I did it again. This is from October 2024 in DALL-E 3. I think DALL-E 3 is the sort of cheap version I could get, so you can be better than that. But, I insist so much, just get me a green triangle to the left of a blue circle. It's not doing it. I'm not saying they can't do it. In fact, the good programs will actually write a little program to do the right drawing, which is close to what I have in mind for humans, right? We have a sort of mental program to draw these things. But it's very, very easy to make them fail still. It's very brittle. Yeah. And when you see that they succeed in high-level math, like Olympiads of mathematics, these are very subtle hybrid systems. They're not just artificial neural networks. They're very complex hybrid systems that are tailored for the task. So they are getting there in the hard way, and let's wait a few years. I'm not optimistic about the human species, except we are creating these devices, right? I mean, we should be proud.
Thank you. Okay, so I guess it's time to thank Stan again for the great talk.
Thank you. Yeah, just disconnected.